The federal government ought to be like a sober sports team and focused on its primary responsibilities and not manipulating or meddling in our lives and spending on somebody else's credit card.
Former Virginia Governor and Senator George Allen today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Buell Thompson. George Allen grew up around football. His father, also named George Allen, was famously an assistant head coach for the NFL's Chicago Bears and then later a head coach for the Los Angeles Rams and the Washington Redskins. Spending so much time in that environment helped shape the young George Allen's worldview, especially when he entered politics, first as a Virginia state delegate, later as the governor of the state, and then one term as a U.S. senator. Now, Allen frequently used sports analogies and metaphors during political debates or to make a point. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, his 2010 book was called What Washington Can Learn from the World of Sports. He and I met one day that summer in his Alexandria, Virginia office to talk about it. In just a moment, our conversation.
Come back with us now as we relive a little piece of our cultural history on Now I've Heard Everything. This interview is from Bill Thompson's 30-year archive. Enjoy.
So here now from 2010, George Allen.
Through the years, you get a perspective on how you grew up. And I grew up really with one foot in the world of sports, and mostly in sports, and then later, obviously, in public service. And looking back through those years in a coach's family where you'd move around all over the country, and my father fortunately allowed me to be on the sidelines and brought me to training camp and the locker rooms, you'd learn certain things. And then ultimately, I did get involved in politics when I was at the University of Virginia. But I just thought, gosh, people hear me speak through the years know I always use sports analogies. And so this is more elaborate. But there are certain things that are the characteristics of sports that everyone likes sports. Meanwhile, when I listen to the people these days, no one says, gosh, I like what's going on in Washington. It's dismay, it's anger. People are stirred up and riled up. And so I was thinking, all right, what are the principles or characteristics of sports which would apply to governance in Washington, and probably the overarching principle of sports. And I realized this years later, growing up in it with my father's teams that were very close, and they're players from all over the country, different races, religions, backgrounds. And all you care about on your teams is whether that person can help the team win. Can they block? Can they tackle, pass, punt, kick, whatever it may be? And it's a meritocracy where there's a level playing field where everyone, regardless of their background, has that equal opportunity to compete and succeed based upon their own hard work, diligence, preparation, or innovative leadership. And that meritocracy is what we should aspire to in society. However, when you look at the government, anybody who's successful, they're envied. They talk about redistributing success, taking a Pittsburgh Steelers Super Bowl trophy and saying, oh, they've won enough of those. Why don't we give one of them to those poor Detroit Lions? They've never even been to a Super Bowl. In sports, that would upset folks. And so
as a Cubs fan, could we get one of those World Series trophies? We haven't had one in over a century.
Yeah, but could you imagine if the Chicago Cubs, the Cubs fans, and heck, when we were in Illinois, when my father was an assistant for the Bears, we'd go to Wrigley Field and Old Comiskey Park there, and the Bears played at Wrigley Field. And so no one dislikes the Cubs, but no one would think, all right, well, the St. Louis Cardinals ought to have one of their World Series championships going to the Chicago Cubs. And I think most Cubs fans would think that's not right either. So in my book, What Washington Can Learn from the World of Sports, I focus on armchair quarterbacks where folks in Washington think they know better than we how to run our businesses or our families. Another one is what gets measured gets better. When you watch a basketball game, you don't guess what the score is. There's measurement. There needs to be accountability in schools as there is accountability in sports. I was speaking a few months ago on energy, at St. Paul's College. It's a historically black college in Virginia. And some of the students who were there were football players and a couple coaches. And I asked one of the coaches, I said, "Hey, coach, y'all ever punt on first down?" And he said, "Nah, you never punt on first down." I said, "That is perfect. That's the title of one of the chapters in my book, because America has been punting on first down on energy policy since the 1970s, in that when OPEC was manipulating production and prices. And I always like to point out how, in sports teams, everyone likes to say, we're number one. The fans are all saying we're number one. Well, in energy, the United States is actually number one in the world with energy resources. Russia's number two. Saudi Arabia is number three. We're number one thanks to our plentiful coal resources in our country. And we ought to be cleanly and creatively using our coal so that we have affordable electricity, and the demand for electricity is outpacing new generation by 2 to 3 to 1. And so we need to stop punting on first down on energy and kicking the can down the road on that, as well as spending issues. I also have a chapter in my book which I entitled, "No One Pays to Watch Officials Officiate." No one goes to a game thinking, gosh, I hope the zebras determine the outcome of a game. They want the players, the teams, the coaches, their strategies, their execution. And there'll be mistakes in games, but the mistakes should be by the players, not the referees determining the outcome of a game. And by that logic, we don't need the federal government and federal officials meddling in our lives, manipulating the marketplace, taking money from a family-owned car dealership and giving it to a competitor and then shutting down some dealers. I mean, that's just wrong what Washington does in that regard. And so I think the federal government ought to be like a sober sports team and focused on its primary responsibilities and not manipulating or meddling in our lives and spending on somebody else's credit card like a bloated, drunken nanny.
Well, to continue your analogy, is the 300 million American member team, that we're the players and the federal government should be the referees? Is that?
Yeah, see, in a free and just society, from my perspective, and I do write about this in the book, there's 4 pillars: freedom of religion, freedom of expression for men and women, private ownership of property, not the government or some agency, and the 4th is the rule of law, where you have fair adjudication of disputes and our God-given rights are protected. So, of course, there has to be rules. Now, people may not go to watch officials officiate, but you do need rules. There are boundaries, there are time limits, and if you didn't have referees in games, they would devolve into arguments and chaos, like some of the pickup games we had as kids. And so that's important, but the referees shouldn't be making up rules as they go. They shouldn't be favoring one side or the other. It's a level playing field. The baskets are at the same height at each end of the court. The goals are the same size on each side of the ice, and so forth. So the competition should be fair and not favoring one side or the other. And too often we see the federal government favoring one or the other. And then that's part of the bailouts, taking taxpayers' money and having the federal government become the lender of last resort to failing companies who can't get loans, or the stock purchaser of last resort when stockholders don't want to buy General Motors stock. And so the federal government gets in the business of auto manufacturing, which is absolutely wrong. So the way that you win or lose in sports is each team has their strategies, their players. In some cases, I talk about the home field advantage that they have it based upon the stadium they play on. And that's where we should be respecting the prerogatives of the people in the states on issues that are under their purview. But the federal government shouldn't be, again, determining who wins or loses. And the people who determine in our free market system, to take the sports analogy, are us, the fans, the consumers. We decide who has the best service, which company has manufactured the best products, and whoever wins is determined by we, the people, not distant bureaucrats or armchair quarterbacks in Washington.
After this short break, George Allen on what the rules should be for setting rules.
Are
you enjoying this conversation so far?
And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2010 conversation with George Allen.
Of course, certainly you're not arguing that there should be no regulations, no rules, no laws. Nobody in the government saying, all right, we're not going to allow you to take unfair advantage of this portion of the marketplace. There have to be those kinds of things in place.
Well, in my view, I don't like limits and I don't like restrictions. And I quote in my book, What Washington Can Learn from Politics, is Thomas Jefferson's definition of a wise and frugal government. And that is, so long as somebody's not harming someone else, leave them free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement. And the government should not take from the mouths of labor the bread they have earned. Now, obviously, there have to be rules and contracts need to be upheld. There are safety regulations that need to be based on sound science and the least burdensome possible, but they have to be logical, reasonable rules. But you also don't want to have the flow of commerce and the flow of inventive thinkers and entrepreneurs being impeded by excessive regulation. I take, for example, in impeding the flow of a game. You hate it when the referees are constantly throwing flags, stopping the game, just being a picky referee. And you don't want the government being that officious nanny pestering and telling us we have to wear a seat belt or speed limit has to be 55 on roads designed for 80 miles an hour, or the federal government has no business telling the states what the beer drinking age should be for young people and blackmailing states on that. So there's certain things the federal government, particularly in national defense, national security, and I have a chapter, Defense Wins Championships, and it also does protect our liberty, and we need a strong, agile defense. But if you're ruining the flow, that's harming the competitiveness of Team America. And we have studies showing how complicated the United States tax code is. And it is one of the most complicated in the world. The billions of dollars that are spent in compliance with the bookkeeping and the forms, and it's so complicated.
The lawyers.
And the lawyers and the CPAs and all the rest. And it's so complicated, even the IRS sometimes gets it wrong. Well, I have, for an example, as an idea, is the freedom to choose flat tax. And Hong Kong has a very complicated tax code. They also have a simple one. And you just say, all right, here's your income, multiply that by 0.20, say 20%, and you pay it. Now, some people like the current tax code because they like the depreciation and deductions. And so you shouldn't change the rules because people made investments on that, just like you wouldn't want to change the rules in the middle of a game. And what they have found in Hong Kong is that people have migrated over to the simplified flat tax. And I think that's an idea that'd be good for our country, to be less stress for people and businesses and all the bookkeeping and the costs involved in it and the anguish and anxiety involved every April 15th or thereabouts with it. And so that would make our country more competitive, still get the tax revenues in for essential government services.
Now, does that threaten to turn us into a National League that doesn't have designated hitter and the American League that does?
Well, that's a good one, Bill. Well, that's the way baseball is. They have a designated hitter in the American League. Well, the point is, I suppose it'd be like a fan. Let me take that analogy. Good one. If some people like to have a designated hitter approach, they can go that way if they like. If they want to be a fan of the National League, because the National League has pitchers going at bat, most likely not getting hit, but they like it that way.
But you got the story in your book of a 16-inning game between the Braves and Mets.
And 16, they wish it were 16 innings.
Well, in the 16th inning, I guess it was, the Braves didn't have any position players left. They sent a pitcher to the plate who hits a home run.
Yeah. Well, see, that's in the chapter, A Tie's Like Kissing a Sister. And in sports, they'll go to great extents with shootouts and extra innings and all the rest to get a winner or loser. And in the world of Washington, they think, oh, there shouldn't be winners and losers. They would like it that if you had races, everyone finishes the race holding hands at the finishing line. But every sprinter wants to be first. So you want
What a thrilling finish that would be.
and they'd feel so good about it. You could hear them exhaling in glee. Isn't that nice? Well, everyone wants to finish in the winner's circle and win, and no one starts a boxing match thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be great if this would end up in a draw after 15 rounds? So as far as that game, that baseball game, it was a game that started on July 4th. It was the Mets and the Braves in Atlanta, and the game was delayed several times by rain. It gets into the 18th inning, and the Braves are out of batters, and they have to send up a relief pitcher who has a batting average of .030, and he hits a home run to tie the game up in the bottom of the 18th. It's the only home run he ever hit in his entire career. The game just continues on, and finally it ends at 3 in the morning. There's a few hundred fans at best left. And it's July 5th, but they had promised fireworks to the fans. So at 3 in the morning, the big fireworks display goes on, and bombs bursting in air wake up folks in Atlanta wondering what's happened. But that's a good example of, to the extent sports will go in games to determine a winner and an outcome. And they're not equal results, but they're equal opportunities.
Your chapter subheadings are so, in some cases, so provocative. There was one in particular said why most coaches vote Republican.
I think the reason why coaches like are more Republican or more conservative is that there is that strict construction to the rules. There are guidelines. There is preparation. There has to be that dedication. People need to earn wins. You don't give people self-esteem, you earn it. And so many of those principles that you find on a football team do apply in a philosophical way to conservative or Republican points of view, where you want to be promoting the work ethic rather than rewarding idle behavior with welfare reform, and that you want to have a vigor. You want to have a competitiveness to it, and recognizing that you just have to work harder and smarter to win rather than have the government or someone else redistribute success to you.
George Allen is 73 now. He lives in Virginia Beach. Now, you can get your copy of What Washington Can Learn from the World of Sports by George Allen by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 2010 conversation with Washington sports mogul Ted Leonsis.
The happier the company, the more successful it will be. The more you have happy employees and happy customers, the more financially solvent that you'll be. And in this time of great stress, it's the happy companies that are winning.
And my 2013 conversation with conservative talk show host and podcaster and now assistant FBI director Dan Bongino.
We think elected officials have the power because we elect them, but what you don't realize when you're behind the scenes is they don't. Who really has the power, Bill, is a series of cronies, bureaucrats, paid-off insiders.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us any place you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, her 1993 book, Dead Man Walking, became a classic of literature and film. She followed it up in 2005 with another book, so we'll revisit my 2005 conversation with Sister Helen Prejean.
If only we just didn't try to deal with death. To be able to handle such a godlike, decision, you live, you die. We don't have a godlike means of being able to arrive at truth.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.